In the early hours of March 25, 1985, at a Whataburger restaurant in Fort Worth, the night manager, Sharon Burns, and her coworker Melvin were on duty. 4 customers remained in the restaurant. 3 of them, 19-year-old Carla Otto, Lisa, and Gary, were sitting in a booth eating, while another was ordering at the counter. Suddenly, the glass door on the east side of the restaurant was shattered by bullets, and 4 gunmen stormed in. Their roles were clear. One guarded the broken east door, another guarded the west door to prevent anyone from escaping. The third gunman walked to the counter and pointed a handgun at Burns and Melvin and ordered them to empty the cash register. The fourth gunman, carrying a shotgun, approached Otto and her friends. He threw a black bag onto the table and commanded, "Otto, fill it up, bitch." With a shotgun pointed at her, Otto raised her hands. However, in the next moment, the sounds of a handgun and a shotgun rang out in quick succession. The handgun shot came from the third one. He accidentally dropped his gun on the ground and it went off while climbing over the counter. On the other side, Otto was struck in the chest at close range by the shotgun and collapsed in a pool of blood. The fourth gunman shot her without warning. After shooting Otto, he showed no sign of panic, immediately turned the shotgun toward the other 2 people, ordering Gary to pick up the bag from the floor. Then, after taking $140, 4 gunmen fled the scene. When the police arrived, Otto was pronounced dead due to the severity of her injuries. She was still holding half a sandwich in her hand. During questioning, Melvin provided a crucial lead. He identified the gunman who had killed Otto. It was a man he had worked with months earlier at a Domino's Pizza, Ronald Allridge. He recognized his voice. Then, the police found that Ronald had been registered by them long ago. 2 months earlier, he had appeared as a witness in another murder investigation. On the evening of January 13th, at a Krusty's pizza shop in South Fort Worth, Ronald, working as a delivery driver, had called the police to report that he had just returned from a delivery to find his coworker, 19-year-old Buddy Joe Webster Jr., lying dead in the back office, and the cash from the register was gone. Webster had been shot above his right ear and was still holding a ballpoint pen in his hand. At the time, investigators performed a gunshot residue test on Ronald, which came back negative. So, Ronald was not classified as a suspect. With no other leads, the case was put aside, and then a crime of the same pattern occurred 3 weeks later, on February 3rd. Just after midnight, Doris Clendenin drove to the convenience store on Sycamore School Road to pick up her 21-year-old son, Brian. However, as she pulled up to the store, she saw a man running out in a panic. When she went inside, she found the change from the cash registers scattered across the floor, and her son Brian was nowhere to be found, so she immediately ran to a nearby restaurant to call the police. When officers arrived, they found the cash register and safe emptied, and the missing Brian was found in the storage room. His hands bound behind his back with electrical wire, and he had been shot twice in the back of the head and was barely breathing. Brian was taken to the hospital, where he died on February 5th. Then, after this murder, a wave of armed robberies swept through Fort Worth. On February 7th, a Pizza Hut was robbed by 2 gunmen. 2 female employees were forced to lie on the floor in the back room, and the cash register and their wallets were emptied. Over the following month, more than 10 similar cases occurred, all targeting small restaurants and convenience stores, with 2 gunmen in each case. In March, the situation changed. The number of gunmen grew from 2 to 3, then to 4. March 9th, 3 gunmen robbed a Pizza Hut, taking money from 16 customers in the store. March 10th, 4 gunmen robbed an International House of Pancakes. Once Melvin identified Ronald in the Whataburger shooting, investigators finally had the piece that connected all the cases. Then, all that remained was to arrest Ronald and find his 3 accomplices. Hours later, the police obtained an arrest warrant for Ronald and began surveillance on his apartment on Anglin Drive in Fort Worth, waiting for the right moment to move in. Around 10:30 a.m., officers watching the building saw a car pull into the parking lot, and the driver got out and entered Ronald's apartment. They immediately asked the apartment manager for information about the man. The manager identified him as 22-year-old James, Ronald's younger brother and roommate. They then checked James's car, and through the window they saw a shotgun lying in the back seat. Based on this discovery, they obtained an arrest warrant for James. At noon, Police moved in and arrested both Ronald and James. During the subsequent search, they found a .22 caliber pistol in Ronald's room, a .25 caliber pistol in James's room, and in the shotgun in the car, there was a spent shell still in the shotgun's chamber. During interrogation, Ronald waived his right to an attorney and confessed to the police about a four-person gang consisting of himself, James, and another pair of brothers, 18-year-old Milton Jarman and 19-year-old Clarence. He admitted they had committed at least 13 armed robberies in total. In his initial questioning, Ronald tried to pin the Whataburger shooting on the Jarman brothers, but since Melvin had identified him, Ronald was forced to admit he was the one who pulled the trigger. Under further questioning, Ronald confessed to more crimes, including the murder of Webster. He said he needed money, so he decided to take the cash from the pizza shop, and because he had to eliminate all witnesses, he shot Webster. The reason his gunshot residue test had come back negative, he explained, was that he had learned that washing his hands could defeat the test. Before calling the police, he had washed them. But the murder of Brian Clendenin, he told them, was not his doing. That was James. Upon learning this, the police immediately brought James in for questioning. On the morning of March 26th, James submitted a written confession, admitting that he had robbed a convenience store and killed Brian. On that day, the two brothers had chosen that store as their target because James had worked there and he knew Brian. They had attended a management training course together, and he also knew where the safe was hidden. That night, Ronald drove and did not take part in the robbery, while James carried his .25 caliber pistol to carry out the robbery. At the time, the store was already closed, but Brian was still inside. James walked to the door and asked Brian through the glass door for change to make a call. Brian recognized James. He opened the door and let him in, giving him the change. The first time, James hesitated. He did not act and returned to the car. Then, Ronald accused James of losing his nerve. Under Ronald's pressure, James walked back to the door, and Brian opened the door for him again. But this time, when James went inside, he took out his gun, brought Brian into the storage room, tied his hands behind his back with electrical wire, and began emptying the cash register in the safe, stuffing the money into a bag. Then, James heard a sound coming from the storage room. He went to check and found that Brian was trying to free himself, so he raised the gun to the back of Brian's head and pulled the trigger twice. Once they learned that both Allridge brothers had confessed, the Jarman brothers chose to cooperate with the police. Clarence later recalled in an interview the conversation in the car after the Whataburger robbery. He said, "Why did you do that? Man, you just shot the girl in cold blood." And Ronald's first reaction was, "You did not know the bitch. Why do you care?" The Jarman brothers were ultimately convicted of aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. Clarence was sentenced to 20 years. Milton was sentenced to 30 years. Both were eventually released. In that same interview, Clarence also said that Ronald is an evil man, and it seemed like whatever Ronald told James to do, James would just do it. Looking back at the lives of Ronald and James, the truth is that Ronald was a criminal steeped in violence from his teenage years, and James was a younger brother pushed onto the path of crime by his older brother. On September 27, 1960, Ronald was born in West Germany, where his father was stationed with the U.S. Army. 2 years later, on November 14, 1962, James was born in Colorado Springs, at another post where their father was serving. In 1969, the family settled in Fort Worth, Texas. Ronald and James shared an attic bedroom. During their childhood, Ronald frequently subjected James to physical abuse, and their parents did not intervene. They attributed Ronald's violent temper to untreated mental illness. Perhaps it was during this period that James developed a pattern of blindly following Ronald's orders. When they entered Wyatt High School, in March 1976, 15-year-old Ronald stole 3 guns, ammunition, and several watches from a department store, and he began carrying one of the guns to school, showing it off to classmates, and said that he was going to shoot someone. On April 12th, the words became real. Outside the boys' restroom at Wyatt High, he raised his gun and fired at a group of students. 15-year-old Lorenzo Nealand was shot in the chest and abdomen and died, while another student, James Christian, was also shot. After his arrest, a psychologist diagnosed Ronald with paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder in which patients firmly believe they are being harmed or targeted and may use violence to protect themselves. And this diagnosis connected all of Ronald's past behaviors, the childhood abuse toward James, and his boasts about killing. Then, Ronald pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. During the time he was incarcerated, James returned to a normal life, working in management in the fast food industry. But in 1983, after his release, Ronald found James and began teaching him how to carry out robberies. Then, by early 1985, in a span of just 10 weeks, they committed a series of armed robberies and murders. In September 1985, Ronald's trial began. He was charged with the murder of Otto. The prosecution presented eyewitness testimony, Melvin's identification of Ronald's voice and face, Gary's identification of the gunman, and the shotgun itself, recovered from the car. The defense claimed that the shooting was an accident, that an accomplice's pistol had discharged, startling Ronald and causing him to accidentally pull the trigger. In order to support this, they even called firearms expert Jack Benton. Benton testified that the trigger pull on the shotgun required only 2.5 pounds of pressure, classifying it as an exceptionally light trigger. However, on cross-examination, Benton admitted that he himself had attempted to make the gunfire accidentally and had failed. Meanwhile, the prosecution's expert testified that the trigger required 4 full pounds of pressure and that the shot was fired by a deliberate, conscious act of firing. In the end, Ronald was sentenced to death. James's trial began in March 1987. Unlike Ronald, his defense strategy was not to deny that he had committed murder. His written confession and ballistic evidence were sufficient for conviction, but rather to argue for a life sentence during the penalty phase. The defense psychologist testified that James was neither a psychopath nor an antisocial personality, and in his opinion, if James were kept away from Ronald, he would not pose a threat to society. But on cross-examination, the psychologist admitted that he had formed these conclusions after only a 2-hour interview with James. The prosecution pointed out that James's actions before and after shooting Brian in the head demonstrated deliberation. He knew the victim could identify him, yet he chose to return. He did not fire in a panic, but first tied Brian's hands with electrical wire, emptied the cash register, and only returned to execute him in an execution-style manner after discovering that Brian had moved. In the end, James was sentenced to death. Ronald spent nearly 10 years on death row. During that time, he filed multiple appeals, claiming errors in evidence and problems with jury instructions, but all were denied. In the early hours of June 8, 1995, Ronald was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. When asked if he had any final words, he replied, "No, I'm not going to say anything." James spent 17 years awaiting execution. In those years, he taught himself to paint. His work gained recognition at the annual Huntsville Prison Art Show and was exhibited in art shows across the United States and Europe. He also sold his work online, prints and handmade greeting cards, through a website operated by supporters. His artwork also caught the attention of some notable figures. For example, actress Susan Sarandon corresponded with him for nearly 8 years. In July 2004, Sarandon visited James at the Livingston prison. These actions ultimately sparked controversy. Andy Cahan, a crime victims' rights advocate from Houston, argued that the visit was precisely what had thrust James into the spotlight. In an interview, he said, "More power to James for turning his life around, but you're not put on death row to rehabilitate." The victims' families also expressed anger. Brian's mother, Doris, told the media, "My 21-year-old son, Brian, was also an artist and a writer who got up and preached in church, but he never got to fulfill his dreams." Brian's brother, Shane, said, "My brother did not even have a chance at life. They had a trial, they put him to death. That's fair. People who say the death penalty is wrong have not gone through this." On the afternoon of August 26, 2004, James was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. When asked for last words, he replied, "Yeah, I want to thank my family and friends, and I'm sorry, I am sorry I destroyed you all's life." Two brothers, they shared the same attic bedroom, they took part in the same crime spree, died the same manner. Ronald remained silent until his death, never once expressing public remorse for his crimes. James, the younger brother who had once blindly followed his older brother, spent 17 years on death row and was still voicing regret in his final moments. One chose silence, one chose confession, but to Webster, Brian, and Otto, lying in their graves, there was no longer any difference, and the death machine of Texas would not stop for either of them.